Well, with more on Premier Smith's Sovereignty Act, we're now joined by Gerson, political commentator and co-founder of The Line. Jen, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on.
Listen, I want to begin with your impressions here. What do you make of this act so far? Because on the one hand, the title has been watered down because it's no longer just the Alberta Sovereignty Act. But on the other hand, it also seems to propose greater powers to ignore federal programs and mandates. So overall, what do you make of what you've heard so far?
I mean, my first impression was just disdain and laughter, like just a lot of guffawing and going, what in the world is this? So I think that there are two issues with this bill, and they're two slightly separate issues. The one is, of course, the legal theory that is going on inside the legislation itself. And I use the word theory pretty lightly because it's borderline Freeman on the land stuff. And then the other issue is the political implication of what is being attempted through this legislation. Now, that is a little bit more interesting. So it's hard to tell right now whether or not the Sovereignty Act within a united Canada is really the dumbest piece of legislation or the most brilliant political tactic one could possibly imagine.
Okay, let's break that up and first begin with the legal argument, because to hear it from Premier Smith, she argues that really what this act does is reinforce the divisions of power and jurisdictions as outlined in the Constitution. And there is this question as to whether or not it would actually survive a court challenge.
Okay, so the problem with a type of Sovereignty Act type thing is that it's either redundant or it's unconstitutional. Either you're just passing a piece of legislation that reaffirms constitutional jurisdiction, which is fine, but why? We already have that in the Constitution. Or you're creating a new set of laws that would be inherently constitutional because it would override that Constitution. And the weird thing about the Sovereignty Act is that it kind of tries to do both. It's very bizarre. So what the Sovereignty Act is trying to do is it's trying to say, look, in a normal confederated system, the federal government or a provincial government passes a law and maybe there's some dispute about whether or not it's encroaching in another order of government's jurisdictional space. In an ordinary time, what you would do is the aggrieved party would then take that order of government to court. A court could pass an injunction and say, we're going to suspend this legislation or suspend these regulations until we can actually decide on this. And then the court, it would go through a court testing process for the court to decide which order of government such a regulation or law appropriately belonged to. Fine, great, we've done that. We've seen that play before. We saw it last with, like, for example, the Carbon Tax Act, right? Like, federal government passes a law, provinces say this is our jurisdiction, it goes through the court process says federal government can pass this. So there's all kinds of contested areas like this. And one of these areas that is very grave, for example, is in criminal law. Remember, for example, when British Columbia said, we are not going to enforce laws against marijuana dispensaries. Mm-hmm. Well, that was in violation of the constitutional right of the federal government to impose criminal law on marijuana. Mm-hmm. So we do see some gray area here. But what this law is attempting to do is it's trying to short circuit that legal process and that seeking an injunction process and saying, no, if we think something's not constitutional, we are going to put the authority to enforce it back into the provincial cabinet. So instead of going to court and seeking an injunction, we're just going to say that this is unconstitutional, and we're going to say that the federal cabinet can just not enforce it.
Yeah, which is why. Sorry, continue.
So that they then don't have to go through the hassle of the legal process, hypothetically, of trying to assert provincial jurisdictional authority. Of course, provinces can't do that. That's not how the system works, and that's why what is being proposed here is unconstitutional, and why it has almost no chance of surviving a constitutional challenge. The first time this act is actually invoked or somebody tries to use it, it will be subject to a constitutional challenge, and it will lose.
Which many people are pointing to already, the fact that it will be almost guaranteed challenged in court and not survive. Yeah. That said, that presupposes a verdict, but you also point to the fact that this could be political brilliance. And I was wondering about the kind of political calculation behind introducing and moving forward with this kind of act in Alberta.
Okay, there's two sort of political gambits here. There's what the legislation actually says. Let's put that aside for a moment, because let's just accept that that's banana crackers. Then there's the political gambit. The political gambit here is that Danielle Smith is coming out to her base and saying, look, I'm being aggressive on Ottawa. I'm taking the fight to Ottawa. I'm being assertive on these issues. We're an aggrieved party. And look at me, I'm being tough. And even if the thing is struck down in a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years by the Supreme Court, doesn't matter, because she's thinking, by then I've already won the next election and we'll have moved on to the next issue. The second thing she's thinking is that even if the Supreme Court does strike it down, she can then use that as an argument to say, Alberta is getting an unfair deal from Confederation. We are subject to particular discrimination. How come we can't do this and all these other provinces can engage in all this kind of chicanery? Well, we're clearly the aggrieved party of Canada. And of course, this can then be parlayed into a grievance politics that has always served conservative governments, and particularly the UCP in this province. Mm-hmm, so it's purely for domestic political purposes. The other question here is, to what extent is she trying to goad the federal government into overstepping or doing something intemperate, as I've heard it said?
Well, it's interesting because we've already heard the Prime Minister says that he's not looking to have a fight over the Sovereignty Act, that he's going to take this wait-and-see attitude.
And that's really smart, because the worst thing that he could do would be to say, I'm going to invoke disallowance and not allow this law to pass, because Smith would then come around and say, look, Justin Trudeau is trying to meddle in our affairs once again. We are the aggrieved province in Alberta. That will play very, very well for her domestically within the Alberta electorate. So essentially, it's a giant game of, I talked to Ian Holloway, who's the Dean of Law School here at University of Calgary, and he's like, look, this is a game of chicken. This isn't legislation. It's a game of chicken. That's all that this is. She's trying to force Twitter to freak out. She's trying to force the NDP opposition leader, Rachel Notley, to come out against Alberta's Sovereignty Act. And she's seeded just enough nonsense in the legislation itself to try and make it seem palatable to more moderate UCP leaders. So it's the dumbest piece of legislation, but it might be very smart politics.
Well, we are watching. Jen, really appreciate the time today. Thank you for the insight.
Anytime.